everyone. So I have been fostering the most fascinating little kitten, Chouchou. Chouchou has a severe cleft palate. He has a very smushed face, and he has the longest fur of any kitten I have ever fostered. So the moment that I met him, I knew I wanted to collect a DNA sample from him and find out what on earth is going on here. So once he was old enough, I went ahead and collected a DNA sample from him by using a swab. I used the Wisdompanel Complete for Cats DNA kit and I sent it in. And yesterday I got the results from that test. And wow. All right. Chouchou's DNA came in. I'm really excited. Moment of truth, Chouchou. Okay, few results. One breed detected.
Oh boy.
Chouchou's results are in. 100% Persian. Oh my gosh, Chouchou. That's crazy. I mean, he looks 100% Persian. Shocking. 100% Persian. Well, I mean, I think it's definitely accurate. Thank you. Mystery is solved. So yeah, he came back as 100% Persian, which explains a lot, I would say. As I've been waiting for his results, I have been collecting a lot of questions from people online about feline genetics, and I thought it would be interesting to bring on Dr. Annette Louviere, who is a veterinarian and feline genetics expert for Wisdompanel. So we're gonna go ahead and connect with her and chat a little bit about Chouchou's results and answer your questions. Hey, Dr. Annette, nice to see you.
Hi, Hannah. It's nice to be here.
I'm so excited. I just got the results for my foster kitten, Chouchou. And it explained a lot. He's 100% Persian, which...
Yes, were you expecting that?
I don't know what I was expecting. I kind of thought maybe it was going to say he was like a Pomeranian or something. He's such an interesting little guy, but I'm really grateful that you are here to have a conversation with me about feline genetics. People online have so many questions, and I have a lot of questions too, so I've compiled a lot. Can you kind of start by just telling me like what your role is at Wisdompanel and kind of your background?
Yes, I am Dr. Annette Louviere, a veterinarian with Wisdompanel. I am on the research and development team. I'm a data and veterinary genetics manager. However, just because I'm on R&D doesn't mean I don't have fingers in other areas. So I do help a lot with product development, content creation, and just general outreach. I am truly a cat nerd, so I very much enjoy this kind of outreach and just spreading the word about cats. My clinical background, I am a feline veterinarian, so this is definitely where my passion lies, even though we, of course, at Wisdom, we test both dogs and cats.
You know, that's so cool that you say you work primarily with felines, because I feel like a lot of people think of DNA testing as something that is more for dogs and less for cats. And I've really enjoyed testing all of our cats in our house and some of our fosters too. And just being able to see not only the ancestry part of it, but the health component of it, which is fascinating to me.
Feline genetics is a little bit behind canine genetics, I will admit that, but there's tons of interest in ongoing research. So with time, I do anticipate we'll understand way, way more than what we even know now. We're just scratching the surface.
How does this work? Maybe this is a really basic question. So I swab Chouchou's mouth, I pop it in the mail, I send it to you, and then what happens?
Like you said, it's just a cheek swab that you send in. What the lab does is it breaks down and collects the DNA from that kitty sample, and then it processes it through the laboratory components. It does, the science behind it, but basically it's actually putting the DNA markers onto a chip. You can think of it like a microscope slide. And so that's how we're able to test for these different DNA markers. And it's a little bit different when we're talking, say, ancestry and DNA likeness versus traits and health variants. So those are more specific markers, whereas looking at ancestry, you can kind of think of it right now as almost like looking at a barcode, and we're trying to read that barcode. So that's where we get all that information and then report it back to you. Of course, for cats, we also include genetic diversity, which plays into the health component, as well as genetic blood typing.
When I saw that Chouchou was Persian, I thought that makes a lot of sense because he has this severe cleft palate. And I have heard that that is something that's more common in brachycephalic breeds. Is that true? And is there a genetic component to cleft palates specifically?
Yes, there is some heritability component to it. It's quite complex, and we honestly don't have our thumbs quite on it in terms of, say, testing for a genetic marker or something of that nature. Brachycephalic breeds, we definitely see it more in. And interestingly, the Siamese breed, we can also see, quite a different facial structure, but we do see it in that pedigree as well. Of course, domestic random bred kitties too.
As you get more samples from people, if you collected samples from, say, like a bunch of cats who had cleft palates, would that then enable you to be able to identify that in future cats more? Or what is the limitation kind of being able to identify cleft palates genetically?
Yes, and this can expand to many different health disorders, but you're right. The more samples we collect and that we can identify that this cat has this particular disorder, we can use that as a subset sampling to do validation studies, but also do that basic research of trying to understand why this occurs. Now, not everything is always just one genetic marker. Sometimes it's a couple markers that come together. So in humans, we can do polygenic risk scores, meaning we can look at several different markers and give a risk score based on what those markers mean and potentially indicate. So that's something that we could maybe translate to the cat side, because I'm sure you're interested, as well as a lot of cat owners out there. Chronic kidney disease is another hot topic too. I mean, we definitely are looking into a lot of different avenues for cat health, but that's one of the top ones.
A question that a lot of people ask, that is a question I have too, is, are there certain congenital diseases that you find are more associated with certain color patterns or certain breeds of cats? A lot of people mentioned, white cats and deafness and that kind of intersection there. Are there diseases that you find are more common in certain types of cats?
There are. So, and that's the beauty of doing panel testing. So sending out and testing kind of this wide variety and not just one or two tests per cat. We can actually look at the prevalence of these different diseases in the cat population as a whole, but then we can break it down to breed types as well and look at the prevalence for each of those. We are actually in the works of publishing a paper looking at least 11,000, I think it's just over 11,000 cat samples, and looking at the prevalence, of different health disorder traits and just all that information, because it's so helpful for owners as well as the veterinary community to understand what we're looking at. Because even though cats are very genetically similar, not every cat population will be affected the same by the same gene. So it's also understanding that kind of relationship.
What is it about white cats and deafness that makes that kind of a more common congenital issue?
So white cats, we can test for the gene insert that causes white. There are actually two different insertions. This is getting way nerdy and technical. Okay, so there's two different insertion lengths. A full insertion length is when we get the bicolored cat. And a partial insertion length is when we get a dominant white or that full white cat more often. Now, when you test through wisdompanel, I'm sure Chouchou had the partial to full white. We can't differentiate the length, but we can still tell you if that insertion is present in the KIT gene. Now, obviously, you can look at the kitty and tell if there's full white, partial white, blue eyes, or anything like that. Now, the reason I mention that is it's the dominant white that's associated with deafness in cats. And especially if the cat has a blue eye. Now, not every blue-eyed cat will be deaf, but it's just a higher likelihood. The true technical reason behind it, it goes back to the white being present. So white is just a lack of pigment. Now, when it's covering the eye, it can also cover internally in the ear. The ear actually has some hairs in the apparatus, that internal hearing apparatus. And if those hairs are depigmented, they can't work. And so they atrophy and degenerate, and therefore that cat becomes deaf in that area.
Wow.
So it's a real technical thing that's color, but then it ties into them being deaf.
It's so interesting because there's kind of all these things that we know as cat people, like, oh, if you're a male tricolor, you're sterile. If you're a white cat with blue eyes, it's more likely that you have deafness. But like the reasons behind these things are really interesting. And I've loved what I've learned so far, but you are just like a wealth of knowledge about all this. I have such a huge list of questions people have for you. I'm like trying to go through and pick which ones to ask you.
You did mention male cats, male calico cats, and I would love to dive into that.
Please.
Okay. So again, this is going to be way more in depth than it probably intended to be, because it can tie into other questions about calicos, but it ties into questions about just orange in general, and orange versus black versus how the other colors and patterns work. And if you want to be a purist, there is a base color for the cat. So that's black or orange. White is a lack of color. So I guess you could put it in that category if you really wanted to. But then there's also coat patterns. And so that's solid color versus the tabby versus color point, like in the Siamese, and then modifications thereof. And I mention that just because when I talk about orange and black, they can have other patterns on top of them, like the tabby or solid color. So this also ties into dominant and recessive. Dominant being you just need one copy of the gene for it to show. Recessive, you have to have two copies, one from each parent, for you to show that, express that phenotype or that appearance. Orange is dominant, for sure. Black is also dominant, but a little less so to orange. Of course, we know there are different chromosomes. There are the sex chromosomes and then the non-sex chromosomes or autosomal chromosomes. Orange is specifically tied to the sex chromosome. Black is on the autosomal chromosome. And so it's not exactly in the same place. Orange, if it's present, will override black. Just FYI. Now, the reason more calicos are female is because orange is on the X chromosome and females are XX. So one X is orange, one X is black, and we can get into why that shows. Whereas a male is XY. And so if they get the X orange chromosome, there'll be an orange tabby. There's nothing else to compete with it. So that's what they'll show. However, if the male is actually born XXY, it's rare, but obviously it can happen. That's when you can get both an X orange and then a non-orange or the black chromosome. And that's where you can get a male calico from. And depending on how that male becomes that XXY is why they're usually sterile. To get into it with the females, if you wanted to just dive a little bit deeper of how calicos show.
Sure.
Each cell, you can only have one X chromosome working because you don't want them competing against each other would maybe be a better way to say it. So there is an X inactivation that happens. So only one X chromosome shows, and it tends to start in a single point and kind of has a little clump and a grouping. And so that's why we can get those patches of color in the torties and calico cats. And the difference between tortie and calico, of course, is the amount of white present there.
So interesting. I got a lot of questions about color patterns from people. One question that was asked was, how is it possible that one litter of kittens can have a bunch of different color patterns?
Yes, and that ties into, again, that interaction of dominant and recessive, because I think that was one question of what's dominant, what's recessive. And that can be a whole conversation in itself, but it does tie into that. So what the kitten expresses, if the mother and father are carriers for a recessive one, they're showing the dominant feature, but then if the kitten gets two recessive copies, they can show a different feature. Color points being one of them. So you need two copies of a color point gene for it to show. Now, another reason is just genetic recombination. So you get 50% of your genes from your mom, 50% from your pop, but each kitten, they can have different recombination to make that set of chromosomes that they inherit, chromosomes and genes. And then the last thing is, of course, a litter of kittens can have multiple fathers.
This is another question that was asked is, can a litter of kittens have more than one father? And if so, can you test, can you do like a paternity test to see if they have different fathers? And I thought that was a really interesting question.
Yes, to the different fathers. So those kittens are technically half siblings, even though they're born in the same litter. Like genetically, they're only 25% similar. So that's another reason you can get all those different color combos. And as far as relatives testing, I will say it's a feature we're very interested in. We just launched canine relatives this year. So it's something that we're diving into for cats. But again, cats are just so complex that we have to do things a little differently.
Is there a future world in which you could submit your cat's DNA test and find their cousins?
That it will definitely would be in the future, but it's something, that's being actively explored.
But it's possible. That would be really interesting because I feel like cats, they proliferate quite readily. Yes. I feel like my cat would have 10 million cousins.
Yes. And honestly, that's part of what's working against us genetically right now, is looking again for that DNA likeness between those pairs. But the way cat breeding has been just in the past, and the way it is so prevalent, they're so great at it, it does make it a little more complicated when we're talking genetics.
So I work obviously with rescued kittens, and the vast majority of rescued kittens come from community cat colonies. So colonies where there's a group of cats, and if they're not sterilized, they are breeding. And sometimes, I would say pretty often, there's inbreeding involved there. Can you talk about the effects of inbreeding? What impact does that have genetically?
What we see there is that it's a higher likelihood for those kittens to inherit, obviously, the dominant health disorders, but then two copies of those recessive disorders. So it definitely increases the likelihood of different illnesses for those kittens. It's an area of interest that all genetic places are really looking into. And when I say that, I mean cat, dog, and human, is how genetics intertwine with our immune system as well. And so we know that obviously plays a role in it. We're still trying to understand to what extent and what influence, but it can affect how your immune system responds too. So not just what genetically you're predisposed to developing, but also how you're fighting other, say, viruses or bacteria that's in the environment.
A question we got that I did not know the answer to was about eye color, and what is how is eye color determined, and is it linked at all to fur color?
It's not exactly linked to fur color, but in some situations it is. So just saying like it's linked to the coat pattern of color points. So color points is temperature dependent albinism. So that's why the cooler parts of the body, so like the ears, the face, the paws, tail, are darker than the warmer parts of the body. Eyes are included. So eyes are, inset a little bit. So it's the blue or the lighter colored eyes, if for like Burmese, for instance, that is temperature dependent albinism taking hold in terms of the pigmentation.
I did not know that about the eyes. I knew that about color points. I don't know what is going on in California. I used to live on the East Coast. I never saw like any color points. And then I moved out here and it feels like we just have them coming out of every alleyway. And so I've learned a lot about them, and I find it so interesting because when we get them, they are white. And then as they get older, you're right, those further points on the body, so the nose, the ears, the tail, they start to darken. And by the time they're adoption age, they can be quite dark. They can have those like chocolate points or lilac point, whatever it is. But I do notice that they all have blue eyes. And I didn't know that was the same thing. That's so interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, obviously kittens are born with blue eyes, but they need time for that pigment to develop for the ones that will develop it. But obviously, yeah, in those color points, it's a part of that temperature dependent albinism there.
Another thing that people mentioned and had questions about was paw size and the number of digits that a cat has. I always have known about polydactyl cats, so cats who have extra, but a few years ago I met my first syndactyl kitten who had fewer paw pads than normal. And somebody asked about that specifically and whether that is carried genetically. If a mom is polydactyl or syndactyl, is that something that can be traced genetically and passed down to her babies?
Yes, and that's something that we can test for in the wisdom panel. So we can test for at least 3 different variants. There are more, and there's one that seems special to the Maine Coon population too. But the most common one is actually the Hemingway, of course, named after the Hemingway cats on the East Coast. But yes, it is a dominant gene that's also, again, getting technical, it has incomplete penetrance, meaning it doesn't affect every cat the same way, but it might not even show in every single cat, even if they carry the gene. But it is something that can be passed down for sure.
We talked a little bit about DNA being entered into the system as more people are participating and submitting wisdom panel DNA kits. What are you personally interested in seeing, as you get more samples and you're able to track some of these things? What are some things that you're excited about on the horizon for getting more information?
Obviously, we talked about chronic kidney disease, maybe even understanding propensity for becoming a diabetic too, like risk factors for that. FIP, how does the immune system play in? Like we were talking about with genetics, like there's got to be some kind of tie-in together. As a cat vet, I would love more information on some of these more common disorders. And even if they're less common, just more information.
Yeah, and I do see that you have some kidney disease information in there already. Is that right?
Yep, polycystic kidney disease.
What is the role of genetic testing in veterinary health? What do you think? Like, is that information that can be helpful for people to bring to their vet?
Yes, and it is something that's still new science. I think the role of how it's playing into veterinary medicine is also evolving as we're understanding. But it is definitely something that veterinarians more and more are starting to use. Wisdom panel pairs with different veterinary clinics, Banfield Vet Hospitals for one. So we can bring this genetic information and tie it into the cases that they're seeing. There are other things that we know affect cats, obviously hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. One that we're learning more about is MDR1, or medication sensitivity. It's often thought of for dogs, but we know it affects cats too. And so just bringing that kind of information about, okay, this cat might be more sensitive to different anesthetic protocols or different common medications can obviously help as you do your day-to-day, but then knowing the genetic risk factors for other disorders, you can preemptively team with your veterinarian to get on top of it, or, you know, try to do some preemptive care instead of trying to keep up with it after those symptoms start showing.
Something that I have really appreciated about the results I've gotten for all my cats is the blood typing, which I didn't even realize wisdompanel did until I got my results. And I was like, this is such good information, especially, you know, Chouchou has surgery in his future. He's got a lot of health issues, and being able to say like, look, here's his blood type is really cool.
It's all in the genes you carry determine your blood type. Same with people and dogs. But the difference for cats, because, you know, cats have to make it more complicated. Cats are born with antibodies against the other blood type groups. So in case anyone wasn't aware, that's why we want to present that health factor. So blood transfusions, like you're mentioning, for a sick kitty, you need to know what blood type they are so you don't cross transfuse with that opposite blood type group. It's also important for neonates, for those young kittens, because type B queens have a lot of antibodies against type A blood types. And if she passes those antibodies in her colostrum, or, you know, the milk in those very first few hours, the kittens absorb that, and if they're type A, they're absorbing anti-type A or antibodies. And so trying to prevent that can definitely make a huge difference in those kittens' first days.
It is really cool to be able to just have that information through wisdompanel. So I think that's all that we have time for. Is there anything else that you want to share?
There was a question about the domestic short hair being another word for cat mutt. And I just want to highlight the huge difference between cat ancestry and dog ancestry. So of course, random bred cats come from long lines of random bred cats. And it's a little bit opposite in terms of dogs. They've been around for so long, and we've actually molded them to do different jobs, whereas cats have been so great at just doing what they do in pest control that for the longest time we let them do their thing. And it's only recently that we've been introducing cat pedigrees, and it's more for the aesthetics. So there is a huge difference between saying like a mixed breed cat and a random bred cat. And I would love to get into that one day, but I just wanted to give a shout out to that question.
Yeah. And you know what, like for me, I obviously, as a rescuer, for me, the best cat is the cat who needs you. And the best cat is the cat who you find outside in the bushes and they grab your heart and you just love them. And, you know, even with those cats, people say, can you still do DNA tests with those cats? Absolutely.
Yes.
I have done these tests on a lot of the kittens that come through here and on all of my personal cats. And I've found such interesting and valuable information. So I really appreciate the work that you guys do. Thank you for chatting with me. This has been so fun. And I just look forward to learning more together over the years.
Every cat's unique and they are wonderful, just simply wonderful. So
thank you for your time. It was great chatting.